When historians describe the year 1927 across the American Midwest, they usually focus on the infrastructure projects above ground, the expansion of the national road system, the concrete highways connecting rural communities, the bridge construction programs that promised to unite isolated towns with modern transportation, and the engineering surveys that mapped America's roadways for the first time with systematic precision. But the real story, the one that barely appeared in transportation journals, the one that even today sits buried in surveying archives, began in places where no roads existed. It started with a straightforward aerial mapping initiative. Survey teams were instructed to photograph rural regions across Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois for the new National Highway Planning Commission. The goal was practical: document existing roads, identify gaps in the network, and determine where new construction would connect farming communities to urban markets. But the moment photographic plates were developed and analysts began studying the images, something unexpected happened. They discovered bridges standing in complete isolation. Throughout the countryside, at locations where no roads appeared on any map, the survey teams found substantial stone and iron bridges spanning rivers, ravines, and valleys. Their construction was undeniable. Their existence was documented. Yet the infrastructure connecting them, the roads they were supposedly built to carry, simply didn't exist. This wasn't mentioned in the public reports about highway planning. It didn't make it into the newspapers celebrating America's transportation progress. But in the internal notes of that year, a quiet phrase appears over and over again. Isolated structures, no connecting infrastructure, purpose uncertain. The official story would later simplify all of this into abandoned railroad bridges, discontinued stagecoach routes, or simply failed development projects that never materialized. Nothing unusual, nothing worth discussion. But the survey photographs from the time, the ones studied in government offices while America planned its automotive future, show something different. They show bridges engineered for substantial traffic loads standing in forests where no trails approach them, stone abutments positioned precisely on either bank of rivers, yet surrounded by virgin woodland that shows no signs of road construction, iron-span bridges with approaches that terminate abruptly in open fields, as if the connecting roads simply vanished into grass and soil. And the more locations they surveyed, the more the patterns stopped looking like isolated failures and more like infrastructure for a network that had been systematically removed, erased, and deliberately forgotten. At first, the survey teams tried to categorize everything in the simplest way possible: old farm bridges for discontinued property access, preliminary construction for roads never completed, speculative building projects abandoned during economic downturns. But as documentation accumulated and more structures were mapped, the inconsistencies multiplied. Why were some of these isolated bridges built with engineering specifications far exceeding anything needed for local traffic? Why were certain structures positioned along precise compass alignments, as if following a planned route network, rather than connecting random settlements? Why did some bridges appear at intervals suggesting systematic spacing, one every 15 to 20 miles, despite having no roads between them? And the question that troubled even the most experienced surveyors: why were these bridges so substantial? The isolated structures weren't simple wooden crossings or crude stone fords. They were major engineering works, multi-span iron bridges, cut stone arch construction, foundations designed for permanent infrastructure. Yet they stood in locations where, according to all official records, no roads had ever existed. Survey teams quietly admitted among themselves that the scale and distribution didn't line up with any known transportation development. And although none of them were using terms like erased highway network, they were acknowledging something just as unsettling. Someone had built these bridges as part of a larger system, not isolated crossings, not experimental structures, components of a road network that no longer appeared on any map. If you're finding this investigation compelling, consider subscribing. These mysteries don't fit neatly into official history, and uncovering them requires looking where conventional narratives refuse to go. As the documentation increased, so did the silence. Survey reports became shorter. Location descriptions became vague. Photographs showing the most dramatic isolated bridges stopped appearing in planning documents. And then certain survey zones were excluded from final maps in late 1927, marked as incomplete documentation where needed, and much of what was photographed was filed into obscurity. Only fragments remain. Survey notes, a collection of aerial photographs, and the quiet testimonies of transportation engineers who saw the full documentation before portions of it were reclassified. But even from what survives, a pattern becomes visible. Bridges too substantial for their locations. Construction quality too high for abandoned projects. Engineering alignment too systematic for random speculation. Infrastructure that seems to belong to a transportation network that was deliberately dismantled. When the survey teams moved beyond the first recognisable isolated bridges, the expectations were simple. They believed they would find a handful of failed developments, perhaps some discontinued stage routes, and scattered remnants of speculative construction. Nothing unusual, nothing extraordinary. But within months, that assumption collapsed because instead of isolated anomalies, the teams documented a systematic pattern that didn't behave the way abandoned infrastructure is supposed to behave. The first anomaly was alignment. Each bridge, whether found in rural Ohio, Indiana farmland, or Illinois prairie, seemed to follow the same directional logic, the same geometric relationships, the same route planning principles. Failed projects shouldn't do that. Different investors, different purposes, different decades. They don't align with precision across hundreds of miles of countryside. Yet, throughout the surveyed region, they did. Bridges in one county aligned exactly with bridges discovered in adjacent counties. Stone abutment orientations maintained the same bearing even when separated by vast distances of empty land. It was as if every structure was built according to an original master plan, one that no longer existed in any transportation department archive. As the workers documented deeper into the countryside, the structures became stranger. Beyond the expected rural crossings and farm bridges, they began encountering construction that looked nothing like local development. Much larger spans, much more sophisticated foundations, engineering that seemed too professionally executed for anything in the region's documented timeline. Some bridges appeared almost over-engineered. Multi-span iron trusses, with perfect load distribution, crafted with precision that didn't match the crude workshops of frontier America. The construction itself raised questions. Stone masonry analysis, conducted years later on select structures, showed cutting precision exceeding typical rural stonework, foundation depths appropriate for major thoroughfares, and design specifications that resembled state highway projects rather than county roads. And then came the discovery that puzzled even the most conservative members of the survey teams. Approach grading, not the bridges themselves standing in isolation, but evidence beneath the vegetation, subtle earthworks, graded embankments leading toward the structures, then stopping abruptly as if the road surface had been deliberately removed, while the underlying preparation remained. Ground surveys at selected sites confirmed it. Beneath the grass and topsoil, teams found compressed subgrade, crushed stone base layers, and drainage culverts, all the indicators of formal road construction. Yet there was no surface, no documented history of roads at these locations, and no explanation for why substantial approach work existed for bridges that supposedly served nothing. Survey photographs taken in 1927 and 1928 show this clearly. Engineers standing beside bridges whose approaches fade into undisturbed forest. Stone arch structures positioned perfectly for traffic that never officially arrived. Iron spans with abutments showing wear patterns consistent with decades of use. Despite standing in locations where no roads appear in any historical record. But the most unsettling detail was not what appeared in the photographs. It was what didn't appear in the archives. The official transportation histories, written for each state, barely mention these structures. Some county records omit them entirely. Certain bridges are summarized with vague terms like early settlement infrastructure or pioneer construction, even though the engineering clearly shows they were far more sophisticated than that. The silence is hard to miss, because if these isolated bridges truly belong to failed development projects, why weren't they documented as such? Why weren't the investment failures, the bankruptcy proceedings, the legal disputes over abandoned construction properly recorded? Why were structures representing substantial capital investment simply forgotten? Even the construction methods raised red flags. Precision too high for speculative ventures, engineering too consistent across vast distances, load ratings appropriate for heavy commercial traffic in regions that never officially supported such commerce, details that look less like hopeful frontier expansion and more like components of a functioning system that was systematically decommissioned. The deeper the team surveyed, the harder it became to fit these findings into the accepted narrative of American infrastructure development. Because bridge by bridge, the countryside began to look less like random settlement patterns and more like a planned network, a transportation system built, operated, and somehow erased from official history. When the survey teams pushed deeper into their documentation of the isolated bridge network, the discoveries stopped resembling anything that belonged to conventional American expansion history. What they began uncovering were systems that didn't match frontier development patterns, didn't match railroad planning, and didn't even match each other in their supposed construction dates. Instead, they formed a strange infrastructural vocabulary, one that seemed to come from a coordinated building program, yet somehow preceded everything in the transportation records. The first shock came with the network density itself. These weren't scattered anomalies or occasional abandoned projects. In certain survey zones, teams documented isolated bridges at intervals of 12 to 18 miles, creating a systematic grid pattern across the landscape. Some regions contained what appeared to be primary routes with bridges every 15 miles, and secondary routes with bridges every 7 to 8 miles, the exact spacing you'd expect in a planned highway network. The distribution wasn't random. It was organised, measured, executed with the kind of systematic planning that America's federal highway system wouldn't achieve until decades later. And then came the feature that still puzzles researchers today: the grade-separated crossings. Officially, they were later labelled as natural terrain features or drainage structures. But nothing about them fits typical rural bridge placement. These were deliberately engineered locations, where one route would have crossed another at different elevations, overpasses and underpasses built into the landscape, even though no roads visibly existed at either level. Some crossing points showed stone abutments at 2 different heights. Others contained what appeared to be ramp grading for elevated approaches. Workers from the 1927 surveys described them in private correspondence as highway interchanges. Not simple bridges, but traffic separation systems designed for high-volume networks, though no official history acknowledges such infrastructure existing in rural America during the relevant period. Another anomaly appeared in the standardization of components. Throughout the survey region, engineers found bridges built to remarkably consistent specifications. Standard span lengths appeared repeatedly: 120 feet, 180 feet, 240 feet, as if fabricated from common design templates. Stone abutments followed uniform dimensional standards. Iron trusses showed identical rivet patterns and member dimensions across structures supposedly built by different contractors. Many components appeared manufactured to precise specifications, mass-produced for a building program that required hundreds of identical structural elements. It created an uncomfortable possibility. The isolated bridges may not be remnants of failed local projects. They may be surviving components of a continental transportation system whose existence was never properly recorded, never officially acknowledged, and never explained in American infrastructure history. The deeper the engineers surveyed, the more impossible it became to dismiss these findings as coincidental failures. What emerged was evidence of systematic route planning, a complete highway network that once connected dozens of communities across multiple states, possibly more. Here's where the story gets truly bizarre. In the months following the initial aerial surveys, documentation teams catalogued over 1,800 isolated bridge structures within the mapped region, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois alone. Not counting bridges on existing roads, 1,800 substantial structures standing in locations where no roads officially existed. That number appeared in preliminary survey reports, but within a year it vanished from final documentation. Published highway planning maps showed only select historical structures or remaining pioneer bridges. The specific count of 1,800 isolated bridges disappeared, almost as if someone decided that number raised too many uncomfortable questions. Because if the Midwest truly had 1,800 substantial bridges serving no documented roads, where did those roads go? Why were they removed? And most importantly, why does no transportation history acknowledge their systematic dismantling? As documentation accumulated, another pattern emerged. Despite apparent construction date variations, all the bridges shared certain characteristics: standard engineering specifications, consistent load ratings, uniform construction quality. It suggested centralized planning, institutional standards, and coordinated construction across a massive program. This wasn't organic frontier development. It was designed, possibly by a single administrative authority with the resources to enforce engineering standards across an entire region. The physical evidence at bridge sites only deepened the mystery. Survey teams found manufactured components that didn't match any known American fabricators. Iron castings with maker's marks from foundries that don't appear in any industrial registry. Stone blocks cut with precision that regional quarries supposedly couldn't achieve. Bridge plates with patent numbers that lead to empty filing records. Some structures appeared deliberately maintained long after their connecting roads vanished. Fresh paint on supposedly abandoned spans, cleared debris from bridge decks in forests miles from any settlement, drainage systems that showed recent cleaning. Others seemed to have their road approaches systematically filled, removed, or ploughed under, as if someone wanted to eliminate evidence of their connection to a larger network. Perhaps most disturbing were the survey markers found near certain isolated bridges, not modern survey monuments, but older markers using measurement systems and notation styles that don't match any documented American surveying practice. Stone pillars with carved designations in numerical codes that contemporary surveyors couldn't interpret. Metal plates with grid references that don't correspond to any known coordinate system. Boundary markers that suggest these bridges once defined territorial divisions in a land management scheme that no longer exists in any archive. Some researchers later claimed these were just property markers or railroad survey remnants, but their consistent placement at major bridge sites and their systematic numbering suggests functionality. A navigation system for a highway network extensive enough to require standardized identification. When you study the final months of the 1927 survey program, something becomes impossible to ignore. The documentation didn't conclude naturally. It was curtailed. Not completed, not finished, stopped. The deeper the survey teams went, the more the tone of their reports changed. Early entries were thorough, documenting each structure's dimensions, condition, and location. But by 1928, the language becomes abbreviated, observations grow cursory, and entire survey zones are marked incomplete without explanation. And this is where the final mystery begins. Because the most systematically organized bridge networks, the most professionally engineered structures, the most obviously planned route corridors, These were the survey zones that were excluded from final documentation first. Engineers described being redirected from certain regions, having photographic coverage restricted, being assigned to map only active transportation corridors without explanation. It wasn't gradual, it was immediate. The official explanation: budget constraints, shifting priorities, focus on modern highway planning. But if it was only about efficiency, why were the most systematic bridge networks, the ones revealing obvious planned routes, the first to be excluded from documentation? And why were obviously abandoned structures in random locations sometimes included in final reports? It doesn't make sense unless those systematic networks posed a different kind of threat, not a budgetary one, a historical one. Perhaps most telling is what happened to the survey photography itself. Original flight records from 1927 show complete aerial coverage of suspect regions, but archived photograph collections show gaps, entire survey zones where images were either removed, never filed, or simply went missing. The isolated bridge networks simply vanished from the permanent record. Even county historical societies found their records changed. Transportation histories written before 1927 sometimes mention extensive early road systems or pioneer highway networks in their regions. Editions published after 1930 describe only scattered trail development and limited frontier roads. The earlier highway references were systematically removed or rewritten. Why was the most extensive evidence, the most systematically organised infrastructure, the most obviously planned network excluded from documentation? Because when you step back, the pattern becomes clear. The aligned bridge corridors were omitted from maps. The standardised components were omitted from maps. The 1,800 isolated structures were omitted from maps. The grade-separated crossings were omitted from maps. The systematic spacing patterns were omitted from maps. And even portions of the photographic record vanished, almost as if the survey programme had accidentally revealed a chapter of American transportation history that wasn't supposed to surface. A chapter older than the national road system, older than the railroad networks, older than the narrative we were given. The 1927 survey wasn't just a highway planning exercise, it was a glimpse, a brief accidental glimpse into a version of American infrastructure that raises more questions than answers. Because if the Midwest stands as the remnant of an entire highway network built by engineers we no longer acknowledge, then the real question is not what was discovered in 1927, it's what else remains hidden in the American countryside. What other bridges, what other road systems, what other convenient rewriting of maps eliminated evidence, before anyone could ask why substantial infrastructure was systematically removed? And why does a nation need to forget? In Foinji Masid 800 bridges. The answer might be simpler and more disturbing than any elaborate theory. Because acknowledging them would require rewriting everything we think we know about who built America's first highways, when they were constructed, and what civilization possessed the organizational capability to coordinate such a network before the United States officially existed. Thanks for watching, and if you found this interesting, well, there are a lot more regions with stories like this. Maybe I'll see you in the next one.